Dorchin. And third is Christopher Dawson. Okay. Okay, so hi everyone, thanks for joining us. I know this is a bit confusing with it all being online. I know we've kind of had to get past all of this, but thanks everyone for joining us, and I'm sure as soon as we can after this circuit breaker, we'll be back in the Great Hall with the numbers that we usually have and good debates we do. But I'm sure this debate will also be an excellent one. The only announcements I have are the two lit talks are still going ahead. So that is Mary Lou McDonald and the leader of the SNP in Westminster, which is lost his name now. Ian Blackford. So Ian Blackford and Mary Lou McDonald are going ahead. If you want to know anything more about that, just check our Facebook page, and those events are on there to register, and we send out a weekly email. If you want to sign up for membership, the person to message is either the page or Tira Chisholm, and then she'll sort that out for you. So as we begin, I just introduce Matthew Sullivan to read out the minutes of last week's meeting.
Hello, everybody. On the 15th of October, the Queen's University Belfast Literary and Scientific Society convened for the fourth ordinary meeting of its 172nd session for the motion, "This House believes the arts are a luxury, not a necessity." As usual, the meeting began with announcements by President Matt Lee. These began with a request for members to join either of our two groups, our Facebook group, the Litteriferum, or our new Discord server. A third group, Literific Memes for God Contains, also on Facebook, which you can join by talking to any member of council, just like Literiferum, was definitely not mentioned because it's not operated by the society and it doesn't exist, and it's a great place to post Literific themed memes. Our training officer, Bunny like the Rabbit, announced that the Society's final in-person training session of probably this year, given the lockdown, would be held the next day. Our external convener, Yasmin Sparks, announced that the Society was now taking sign-ups to the Irish Times debating competition. And finally, it was announced that our second Lit Talk guest of the year would be Ian Blackford, to be live streamed on the 27th of November. This is followed by the minutes, read by yours truly, followed by private members' business. Jamie Warren brought up the impending increase in restrictions, asking the House why certain people believe there to be no scientific basis for the lockdown, despite there being strong evidence to the contrary. Responses were heard from Keir Crozier and Ryan Hoey. Yasmin Sparks asked the House their opinion on the recent spree of stabbing attacks in Belfast. Responses were heard from Jody Morrow, Mark Gilmore and Tira Chisholm. Nicholas Ryan asked the House their opinion on the US electoral system. This spawned a lively debate with responses heard from Amy Doherty, James Orchin, Ira Swale, Ryan Hoey, Artie Byrne and Mark Gilmore. This is followed by President's questions and the vote of prior opinion, with 5 votes for the proposition, 31 votes for the opposition and 6 abstentions. The House made it fairly clear that they initially believed that the arts were definitely a necessity and not just a luxury. Speaking first for the proposition was Emily Monroe. She made the case that the arts are a luxury because the capitalist society treats them as such. For arts to truly be considered a necessity, she said, it should be accessible to everybody in society, arguing that the high price of art creates a barrier to consumption for the ordinary person. She stated that the elitism of the arts world makes it impossible for outsiders to come in and establish themselves, asking how it could be considered a necessary part of life when it's so inaccessible to so many people. Speaking first for the opposition was Jody Morrow. She gave the analogy that while healthcare is a necessity, £1,000 nose jobs are clearly less necessary than basic healthcare, similar to the difference between most art and extremely expensive art. She stated that the human race is one filled with passion, that while the engineering and sciences may keep us alive, beauty and the arts are what we live for. She gave examples of ways in which we use arts in communication, arguing that without the arts, it would be far more difficult to communicate complex ideas to society, even just things such as news. She argued that the arts make technology more accessible to society, from written language to Apple computers. She then gave examples of the economic benefits of the arts in the UK and in our local economy, and asked why we were so reluctant to invest in an industry that was growing 5 times faster than the rest of the economy. Speaking second for the proposition was Ryan Hoey. He began with the premise that everyone would agree that QUB was far better than Ulster University. On this basis, he made the point that you could not study art at Queen's, and that if such an esteemed institution sees no purpose in the arts, why then should we? He stated that it is far more likely for someone who studied the arts to be unemployed, as opposed to someone who had studied a proper degree. He told the House that one cannot eat a painting. He said that the arts are a waste, and that from the packaging in our foods to the millions spent on fine art, it was immoral to waste so much money on these luxuries rather than on feeding starving children. He argued that while the arts are certainly important to our lives, it is wrong to say that they are necessary to survive. Speaking second for the opposition was Daniel Singleton. He asked, if art was dispensable and not a necessity, what of the pieces of art that have influenced our own lives? He said that in a world without art, there would be no room for freedom of speech or individual thought or fancy debating chambers. He told the House that art doesn't have to cost money, that any creative work was art and that therefore art is accessible to everybody. He gave the example of many artists who started in poverty and rose to fame and wealth through their art, arguing that we needed these kinds of people making art so that we can hear the voices of those who are marginalized in society. He gave the further example that children in early life are taught through art, and it's necessary in those crucial moments to develop critical thinking and confidence in those children, and that even in adult life, the arts are a great way to promote stabilization and rehabilitation in the brain. He asked how we could exist in a world without arts, saying that any society must strive to better itself to survive, and that the arts are indispensable in achieving this. Speaking third for the proposition was Bunny Like the Rabbit Chandran. She stated that it was on the proposition to define necessity and to show that the arts did not fit this category. She stated that while the arts do help with mental health issues, this doesn't mean that they are a necessity, arguing that necessities are those things which we will die the fastest without, such as oxygen or water or food, not the arts. She pointed out that plenty of life, from trees to animals, were perfectly capable of surviving without art, that even healthcare shouldn't be considered a necessity because there are people in the world who survive without it. Speaking third for the opposition and concluding the debate was Callum Connolly Galway. He argued that art is food for the soul, that without it, life would become despair and not be worth living. He argued that if we call the arts a luxury, we would give power to those with wealth in society and restrict art only to these people. He went on to say that the arts benefit us all individually, that life would be empty without the ability to look at the world and within ourselves, claiming that the mind needs something to channel it. He asked the House to choose the feast offered by the opposition rather than the starvation offered by the proposition. Questions were heard from Hephzibah Wilson, Nathan Whaley, and James Orchin. The vote of speakerability was held with 10 votes for the proposition, 23 votes for the opposition, and 5 abstentions, meaning that the motion "This House believes the arts are a luxury, not a necessity" was not carried. The evening concluded with the President thanking the Council and all members for supporting the Society and making all of this possible. May I take the minutes as read? I'll take that as a yes. Thank you.
We can't hear you.
Thank you. So how we're going to operate private members business, which it now turns to, is by raising your hand on the raise your hand function. You could raise a piece of private members business or respond to that private members business. So now I ask, if anyone has any private members business, this is business that you might have seen in the news, just topical things that you want to raise, or a little kind of side debate in this meeting, then please do raise your hand and we'll get to you. Mr. Grant Warren.
Yes, so just with regards to tonight, well, later on being the final US presidential debate, and what many commentators are saying will be Trump's potentially last chance to turn the tide in the polls, and maybe have a surprise, score a surprise victory. I was wondering what the House believes. Does Trump actually have a realistic opportunity to overturn these polls and prove the critics wrong once again.
Any responses to that? Emily Monroe.
I mean, I would like to say from my perspective that I think Trump is past the point of no return, and the fact that anyone supports him at all is baffling to me. However, a lot of people were of that opinion in 2016 and then he became president. So I think it's impossible to say either way whether or not what he says or does tonight could help or hinder him, given just what an enigma he is. That's how I see it anyway.
Any other responses to that? Christopher Dawson.
Yes. Is this the microphone that I'm using? Can anybody tell?
You loud and clear.
Okay, so this is the right. So it's not my mic, my laptop. Okay. Well, my opinion is that over the past 4 years, people's opinions on Trump has solidified. I don't think there's any wiggle room. I think he's got that solid 40% who are on his side, and I think most of everybody else would not consider voting him, no matter what Joe Biden does. And the lead in the polls looks to be insurmountable. I think it's 10, 11 points, and Trump looks likely to lose a lot of states that you wouldn't expect a Republican to lose. So my opinion is that Trump can't pull it back.
Any further comments on this? No. Yes. Kira Swell.
Basically, my opinion on the matter is most likely he will lose, but at the same time, the polls might cause less people to go out to vote, because at the end of the day, the polls are saying that he will most likely lose. So it might have, a Brexit kind of situation where everyone goes, he's going to lose anyway, I don't care enough to go out and vote. So that could shift things in Trump's favor. However, I do think because of all the campaigning around this election about how important this election is, people are trying to go out and vote. I think it's one of the records is how many people are going out to vote, which is great. But yeah, so that's a thing.
Thank you. Any further comments on this about whether Trump has already lost the presidency? Mr. Luke Holmes.
Sorry, can you hear me all right?
Yes, that's great, Luke.
That's good. Not so much on Trump and Biden, but more, I think, following Kira, the voting situation. I've seen, allegedly videos of people who have been waiting in lines for up from 6 hours to, say, 11 hours. And along with, other news of, the GOP, I think, in California, admitting that they've been placing misleading ballot boxes. It seems like a really messed up situation over there right now in regards to just voting in general. So I don't know if there's any thoughts on that.
Kira?
I mentioned this last week, but again, it's a terrible situation that the USA is under right now in terms of voting. There's some places, massive states like Texas that only have one polling place. Trump has literally put doubt on postal voting. There's a lot of problems in terms of funding for the postal vote system because Trump hasn't given it. And basically, in an election where postal voting is going to be more important than ever, a lot of people don't see that they have the option to postal vote anymore, that they have to go and vote in person in a deadly pandemic, which is awful. But yeah, the voting situation in America is horrendous right now, I agree.
Any further comments on this? No. Any further pieces of private members' business? Anyone else got anything they wish to raise? Jay Radcliffe. Any comments on AOC's willingness to play The Last of Us or Among Us, whatever it is? Yes, Emily Monroe.
I was looking at the numbers for that actually, and apparently, was it like Ninja's returned to Twitch or whatever after he'd gone to a different platform? She outsold him by like 5 or 6 times over, which I find fascinating. The one thing I definitely appreciate, like aside from their politics about AOC and sort of the squad that surrounds her, is their willingness to sort of adapt with the times and find new ways to like get people engaged in politics. I feel like a lot of the old guard Democrats are very out of touch, perhaps, and anytime a politician finds a new and sort of innovative and not been done before way to get people to engage with politics, I see that as a win. So I think it was pretty cool.
Grant Warren.
Yeah, I think I just agree with some of the previous comments about AOC's kind of willingness to kind of engage in politics in ways that are more innovative and obviously move with the times, particularly with comparison to the old guard, kind of Biden, like any kind of Democratic senator or, Chuck Grassley or Nancy Pelosi. But at the same time, I think there's a barrier where you cross the line where if you purely conduct politics through social media, whether it be Twitter or Instagram, you kind of lose grip on the actual kind of the grittiness of politics, and you kind of lose the grip on what you're almost living in an echo chamber where you're not really listening to the concerns of people on the ground, and you're just playing to an audience, whether it be a very specific demographic of young people or you're just listening to people who have the same opinions as you.
Any further comments? Any responses to that? Yes, Mr. J. Radcliffe. Any responses to that? No. Okay, we'll move on to President's questions. Does anyone have any questions for me, El Presidente? Yes, Emily Monroe.
Okay, this is sort of a fun one, I feel like. I saw in the news today that I think a Dutch journalist managed to hack Donald Trump's Twitter account by guessing the password, which was MAGA 2020. So my question to you is, if you could hack anyone's Twitter account, who would it be and what password would you guess?
Oh, if I could hack anyone's Twitter account, who would it be and what password would I guess? Maybe Arlene Foster, and I guess the password could be "Come on, Arlene." 1. That's my guess. Any other questions for the president? Yes, Luke Holmes. Luke.
Sorry, I unmuted my mic on the headset, not the actual Teams call. Sorry. Okay,
No.
presuming this wasn't asked last week, what are the president's plans for Halloween?
What are the president's plans for Halloween? So, as you know, we live in a society now which is locked down. So, unfortunately, trick or treating is probably out of the remit at the moment. I plan on just staying in, probably watching a horror film, maybe one of the Insidious films. They're kind of my favorite horror franchise or thriller franchise, as well as The Conjuring. So probably just watch a few of those films and just chill, maybe have a few drinks. That'll be about it. Thanks, Luke. Any other questions? No. Okay, brilliant. So now we move on to the actual debate. I'm just going to specify some things of how it's going to run. Speeches are going to remain at 7 minutes. You'll hear the bell after the first minute, so I need to check that you can all hear that. Is that loud enough? Can everyone hear that?
Yep, I can hear it.
That'll be after the first minute, and then on the 6th minute, and when you near 7 minutes, and then after that, it'll just keep echoing, and you probably never want to join a Teams call with the bell in it ever again. So that's how it's going to work for normal speeches and normal timing. If you want to ask a point of information, make sure it's in the unprotected time. You can raise your hand using the raise your hand function, or you can unmute your mic and say point of information. Please just don't use barracking. If you keep asking points of information after another person, then we're going to have to just try and sort that out. Jay will try and get rid of you in some form of another. And that's how it's going to work. Hopefully we get through this all right. I'm very apprehensive. I know we've all been on lectures and tutorials where things haven't really gone to plan over Teams. So we'll see how we go. So now it turns to the vote of prior opinion. So this is the vote on the motion as it stands without hearing any of the speakers talk. And without hearing any speeches. So it's just what you think about the motion coming into this debate. So the motion is this House will judge historical figures by modern standards. As all those are in the favour of aye, please like or react to aye. And all those who believe nay, like or react to nay. And all those who wish to abstain, please do the same thing for the abstain. They're all on the chat. So yeah. Okay. If you can't react to it, I know there's been some issues when we've had council meetings and things with not being able to react to it. Feel free just to write yes, aye, nay, or abstain in the chat. We'll make sure your vote's counted. Okay. I won't double count you, Keir. Give it another 10 seconds. So please go on the chat and react to aye, nay, or abstain. Umar, someone's just belled the flat. Could you run down and check who it is? Okay, right. Mr. Secretary, could you read back the results as follows?
With 5 votes for the proposition, 3 votes for the opposition, and 3 votes for the abstention, the proposition has it.
Thank you. Okay, brilliant. So now it turns to me to introduce our first speaker for the proposition, which is Mr. Keir Crozier.
Okay, before I start, I should say that given I'll be reading off a Microsoft Word document, I won't be able to see if anyone raises their hand, so if you want to ask a POI, you'll have to shout it out, which is fine. All right then, so ladies and gentlemen of the House, tonight we will be proposing the argument that we should judge historical figures by modern standards. We will expose the hypocrisy of failing to do so, as well as the danger it poses to us today. Whilst this motion may conjure up images of angry mobs tearing down and defacing statues, and undoubtedly that is how the opposition will try to present our argument, it needn't be like this, and indeed we argue that it should not. Rather than being extremist and intransigent, what we propose is in fact moderate and rational, namely the right to have a grown-up conversation about the figures of the past. We believe that we as people are intelligent and mature enough to do this and to make up our own minds on the balance of the evidence available. And again, we must remember the title of tonight's motion, not that this House believes that historical figures were bad, but that we would judge them and we do not propose or expect that all or even most historical figures will be condemned any more than everyone who finds themselves in a court of law is found guilty. The alternative to our proposal, namely to stick our fingers in our ears and swat away any criticism with the tired old mantra they were products of their time, is that we give succor to the extremists, those ill-informed sorts who would desecrate the cenotaph or attack the likes of Peel and Gladstone for things which their ancestors did rather than which the great men did themselves. It is important to consider that judging historical figures by current standards is by no means a new phenomenon. The Romans, for example, would frequently remove or repurpose statues of whom they were no longer proud, a practice which they called damnatio memoriae. Similarly, the Soviet Union in the era of Khrushchev underwent a process of de-Stalinization, whereby relics of the former leader were removed, including the renaming of the city Stalingrad as Volgograd. Later on, in 1991, Leningrad was restored to its former name of St. Petersburg. Therefore, we can see that there is sound precedent for re-evaluating historical figures in the light of new information and changing values.
Point of information.
Go ahead there.
Just for the minutes, it's Grant Moore. I just think using the Soviet Union as precedent for, tearing down, old symbols of the past, I don't quite get the logic of using a tyrannical regime as just, surely it would be better to highlight, a modern democracy where this is a freedom-loving democracy, where this kind of precedent is embraced, because I don't really take the point.
Well, actually, if you look at it, Stalinism and the era of Stalin was the darkest period of the Soviet Union in terms of its brutality. And when Khrushchev came to power, he knew that in terms of to make the country more respectable and acceptable, that era would need to be erased. And similarly, actually, on the Leningrad point, well, that happened in 1991 after the fall of the Soviet Union when it changed to the Russian Federation. So you're not quite accurate there, but I'll continue. We are not advocating the whitewashing of any part of our history that troubles us, quite the opposite. Rather than simply destroying the evidence that those who fail the test of modern morality ever existed, we can present them in a light which we now see fit. We can put information beside their statues explaining how they came to be there, but why today we would take a different view of these people. If, after a proper debate and consultation, it is decided that certain people are simply too problematic to literally be put on a pedestal, they can be moved to museums where people can see them in an historical context containing both good and bad things. Former communist countries in Eastern Europe have done this with their Soviet-era statues by placing them in large memorial parks. People can still see them if they wish, but there is a collective acceptance that they are not fit to tower over us in our town squares or outside our public buildings. These people will always be part of our past, but the ability to judge gives us the agency to decide which ones we want to have a role in our present and in our future. It is important for us to have a strong relationship with our past in order to have a sense of pride and belonging. Indeed, the philosopher and politician Edmund Burke viewed the living as being in a social contract with the dead and those who had not yet been born. However, attempting to ignore those less savoury elements in the lives of our historical figures simply leads to a misunderstanding of the past, which all too readily manifests itself as an unhealthy romanticization of a time which in fact never existed. When we uncritically portray the titans of our history as saintly figures without flaws, we do ourselves a disservice, as people today are flawed, just as they were then. But by suppressing this simple fact, it becomes all too easy to imagine that the past was some sort of idyllic time, populated by whiter-than-white men, and occasionally women, whose biographies read as a list of wonderful and sometimes heroic achievements, and who never erred. But they did err. Some of them erred greatly, and we need to have these difficult conversations to decide how we want to remember these figures. When we lionize the figures of the past, we look at that period through rose-tinted glasses, when in fact, for the vast majority of people today, especially for women, ethnic minorities, gay people, trans people, there has never been a better time to be alive. We need to properly evaluate the figures of the past then, to properly understand and appreciate how we came to be where we are today and where we ought to go tomorrow. When we see abuses in foreign countries, we do not generally, with a few regrettable exceptions, simply excuse it by saying, oh well, that's just their culture. We impose diplomatic and economic sanctions, and sometimes even take military action. L.P. Hartley famously said, the past is a foreign country, they do things differently there. But frankly, if the past actually he was a foreign country, we would probably invade it. And therefore, you should vote with the proposition tonight. Thank you.
Thank you, Keir, for that resounding speech. Just a note on if people can keep their cameras off whilst people are speaking, that makes it easier. And I think, yeah, it should be fine. So thank you. Thanks, Keir. So now it turns to introduce the first speaker for the opposition. To introduce the opposition's argument tonight is Louis Johnson.
We can't hear.
Yeah, can't hear you.
Great, brilliant start, great. No matter. Right then, okay, should I just go?
Ready when you are, ready when you are.
Brilliant, okay, just give me 1 second. Okay, so as you all know, the appalling murder of George Floyd during the midst of the pandemic this year reignited the ever-present issue of racism within our society. And as you all know, the Black Lives Matter movement spread across the world and attracted national interest in our country for the first time. Perhaps the most powerful image of these protests was the toppling of the statue of Edward Colston, whose name was widely commemorated in Bristol landmarks. His statue was thrown into the very same Bristol dock, which had harboured his African slave ships 300 years ago. But make no mistake, we are not the ones standing in front of the statues. The events surrounding Colston and the wealth of time handed to us by lockdown gave us all the chance to rethink our perspectives on history and to rightfully recognise the problematic past of some of our most revered figures, whilst drawing attention to and decrying racism, sexism and any form of discrimination is of the utmost importance in our modern and diverse society. Judging figures from history by the same standard we judge ourselves to is misguided, albeit well-intentioned. It risks devaluing one of the most important components of our understanding, as we will attempt to show arguing against the motion. Take Gandhi, for example, a man many of you will know and would consider probably one of the most virtuous leaders of the 20th century. Gandhi, using peaceful means, not only guided his nation to a hopeful and democratic future, but lent his methods of peaceful protest to Martin Luther King and every other movement for justice seen in the Western world in the latter half of the 20th century. However, the man who is remembered as the catalyst, if not the initiator, of three of the major revolutions of the 20th century, the movements against colonialism, racism, and violence, values which the motion itself claims to uphold, he would have been cancelled in 2020. Gandhi spoke of Africans as troublesome, very dirty, and living like animals. He also slept at the age of 70, naked. Yep, sorry, I see we've got a question here.
So you're saying that, yes, you know, Gandhi had this troubled past. Then why don't we give people all of the information so they can judge them themselves, instead of keeping this image of Gandhi being this heroic figure and not showing people the information so they can judge for themselves?
In no part of that have I suggested that we don't give people the information. Of course we should give people the information. That's not what the debate is about. The debate is asking whether we should take Gandhi, take what he has said, and then judge him by modern standards, in which case obviously he would fall short. We good to continue?
Yep, continue away.
Brilliant. So anyways, he slept with his teenage niece at the age of 70 in order to, quote, test his willpower to abstain from sex. Contrast this with the words of David Starkey, a historian who last month said that slavery was not genocide, otherwise there would not be so many damn blacks in Africa or in Britain. An awful lot of them survived. These comments, which are clearly unacceptable, led to him being ostracized from his community, and he was even investigated by the police, and rightly so. And I just want to make this very clear. This is modern standards. This is the standards by which we hold people in our communities to today. Despite what the proposition says, if someone said something like what Gandhi said, that is the standard of today in which we would apply, and you can imagine what would happen. Whilst these actions are clearly abhorrent and cannot be excused, we can attempt to explain how such a symbol of equality... Point?
Yes. While you cherry-pick Gandhi as an example to be held to modern standards, surely the rest of the historical context would also be held to modern standards, including the behavior of all of the people in India and all of the governments and forces that were involved in the movement, whether pro or against at the time.
Yes, of course, you've got to consider the context of the time. That's what 100%. I'd agree with you. Let's go.
Yep, great. Carry on as soon as you've made the point.
Brilliant. Okay. So, of course, Gandhi, like everyone who has ever lived, was a product of his time. He grew up in British India, a colony of the British Empire. His society was built on the idea that white Europeans were superior, and it was their destiny to subject the rest of the world to colonial rule. Until later in his life, Gandhi never met an African. He didn't have the chance to view the world through our modern and multicultural lens. A devout Hindu, Gandhi practiced brahmacharya, a form of absolute holiness which involved, amongst other things, putting oneself in compromising positions to test celibacy. However, in a setting where it was acceptable to marry 4 wives, Gandhi used his position to ensure India became democratic, emancipating 187 million women in 1947. Whilst it is crucial to recognise the blotches that stain the memory of many of our most revered figures, we must do so in context. We take for granted that in our tolerant age we live in, the men who came before us gave their lives to give us this privilege. Gandhi fought against the prevailing views of his day to build a world based on peace, tolerance, and equality. But of course, he did not get everything right. Not denouncing problematic leaders does not mean that we cannot denounce discrimination when it arises. Racism and sexism were no less repulsive when they existed 100 years ago. Racism and sexism were never okay. People simply wrongly believed that they were. We must remember, when passing judgment, that we who are alive today can come to see how our actions were wrong, acknowledge them, show remorse. The dead do not have that luxury, and in truth, neither will we. The notion that the greatest minds can still be blind to mistakes and evils, if they are widespread enough, is a humbling lesson to ourselves. In 200 years' time, a group of students will look back on us and discuss how we could claim morality when 1 in 5 children born today will never attend school, and 1% of the world's population owns as much as the bottom 44. When contemplating this motion, we must consider how we ourselves will be contemplated one day. Last week, this House agreed that arts are a necessity and not a luxury. I compel you to view history in the same way. For without the proper lens, we cannot celebrate Emmeline Pankhurst the colonialist, Aristotle the sexist, and Albert Einstein the racist. But why stop there? If we carry the motion, then we fall down the rabbit hole and must condemn every Prime Minister before David Cameron for not legalising gay marriage, as by modern standards, that should have been their top priorities. History is a privilege. It is a privilege to make use of the collections, books, documentaries, and artifacts to be able to understand those that came before us and why the world looks the way it does today. It is not our job as young historians to enter the minds of the people of the past, but to learn from their lives and the lessons they taught us to build a brighter future. History is not a burden on the mind, but an illumination of the soul. And I hope you agree. Thank you.
Thank you for that, Louis. That is amazing. Is that an amazing maiden speech as well, I think. So thanks, Louis.
Yeah, that was the first one. No worries.
Yeah, brilliant. Thank you. So now it turns to introduce the second speaker for the proposition, Laura Armstrong.
Hello, everyone. Can you see me? Yeah?
Yeah.
Okay, perfect. Well, hello, everyone. Before I begin, I do want to thank everybody for coming online this evening to watch our debate and to support the society. It is really appreciated, and I hope that everybody is keeping safe and well, and hopefully we'll see each other in person very soon. Okay, so now on to my speech. So we as the proposition are arguing that the House should judge historical figures, the historical figures of the past based on the moral standards held in society today. Now, before I elaborate on the justification for why doing so is so important, I feel it necessary to first preference something that I feel that the opposition may be trying to accuse us of. Under this motion, we are not promoting erasing history or erasing individuals from history who do not adhere to the moral standards of today. Instead, I must stress that what we are arguing is the complete opposite. Judging the past doesn't mean cutting out the past. Instead, we are advocating for a more honest and balanced depiction of history and the historical figures within it. For society to evolve and better itself, we must be informed and educated how the actions of historical figures have both benefited us in society, so we can celebrate their positive achievements, and additionally how the actions may have hindered us as a society, so that we can hold humanity accountable and learn from our actions. So, why are we arguing that it is so necessary for humanity to be able to hold ourselves responsible for our past actions and for our past mistakes to be condemned? So, I'm going to look at this in my speech through 3 branches. First, we're going to look at how judging the past based on our evolved standards helps us to better recognize where humanity has made a mistake and therefore enable us to better and improve ourselves as a society. Second, I'm going to look at how our argument is used today in holding historical figures to account. For example, and the example I'm going to look at is Nazi Germany, and therefore to not extend these principles to all historical figures is simply picking and choosing who to judge and who to not. And lastly, I'm going to touch on the issue of products of their time and how historical figures can still be judged on today's standard while accounting the context that they were in. Now, as many of you and potentially many members of even the opposition would agree that as humans, our moral standards are constantly evolving. As a species, we constantly try to move forward, improving and bettering ourselves. Now, of course, we can pick out examples where we could argue that humanity has taken a few steps back in improving ourselves, but overall, humanity strives to get better. However, a critical part of humanity being able to better itself from how we were in the past is being able to look critically through the lens of this improving and evolving morality at its history and the influential figures that made that history. Critiquing the actions of history does not only enable us to a better understanding of society now, for example, recognizing how widespread slavery was betters our understanding of institutionalized and systematic racism today, but as well as recognizing the past achievements and their mistakes help us to determine how to better ourselves in the future. As regard our future and now, of course, that means that our moral standards, as our moral standards continue to evolve, the future will one day judge us on our actions that we hold today. Therefore, holding us accountable for actions that future evolved moral standards may deem as being mistakes that we make today. For example, maybe our treatment of animals, our neglect of the environment, and our acceptance of poverty. And by doing this, this enables humanity to continue to recognize its mistakes and seek to better themselves by learning from them and preventing such in the future. Now, this process that I've just explained is something that we do currently do with historical figures, as even today we continue to hold those that perpetrated the Holocaust account for their actions. In Germany today, their moral standards have clearly evolved since the 1930s and 40s. However, in society, and I'm sure much of the House would agree, that we wouldn't withhold judgment from those who perpetrated those actions in Nazi Germany and allow them to hide behind the argument that since they operated in accordance with the moral standards of the regime in which they lived in, then we can't judge them. Therefore, we need to recognize that since we wouldn't uphold an argument from an historical Nazi, that we cannot judge them on their actions because lots of people persecuted the Jews in Nazi Germany, then we cannot uphold arguments from historical slave owners and those that perpetrated the transatlantic slave trade, that we cannot judge their actions because lots of people in the West had slaves. As this creates a dangerous grey area where we allow ourselves to ignore some actions and mistakes of the past and not others. And this example of Nazi Germany presents how our proposition operates in practice. As you can see, it clearly does not involve removing or erasing these figures from history, but instead focuses on educating society of their actions and holding their actions to account and learning from them to prevent history repeating itself. Okay, lastly, and I know that I'm running out of time, I do want to mention I do want to just mention the argument that it's unfair to judge historical figures because they're products of their time. And I understand that it is important to understand that the context of historical figures can still be accounted for when judging one's actions in the past. An action can still be judged as a success and a mistake to humanity while accounting the context it was said in or performed in. For example, looking at the insight that the historical figure would have had. For example, looking at whether there was a significant presence of an abolition movement at the time or there was prominent campaigns for suffragettes. Oh, I did. Okay. Overall, so in conclusion, overall, I hope that the House can side with the proposition this evening that we should hold to historical figures based on modern standards, as this does not mean cancelling them and erasing their presence from history, but recognising a full and truthful depiction of their legacy that we can critique and we can learn from to better ourselves and to amend our own moral mistakes. Thank you all for listening.
Thank you. Thanks, Laura. And now it turns to introduce the second speaker for the opposition, the collator of everything which is a fun and obscure fact, Mr. James Orchin.
Hello. Just before I start here, I just want to say I'll be using Google Docs, so I won't be able to see if anyone actually raises their hand during this. So just sort of a point there to make before I start here.
James, could I just ask you to adjust maybe your microphone? You're a bit quiet.
You want me to sort of smother my
No.
me here now?
I'm just struggling to hear you a little bit, James.
Yeah, I'm the
I
same.
can't hear
Very,
you.
very low. Yeah.
Is that better now?
A little bit.
No, not really.
No.
Oh wow.
I reckon it might be using your earphones audio.
You know what? Give me a second. I'm just going to go and plug in my other headphones.
There's a microphone attached to your headphones. If you just hold that closer to your mouth, maybe.
Okay, whilst James is sourcing his other headphones, I just like to echo what Laura said at the start of her speech. It's really nice for everyone to be on here. Hope you're keeping safe, and thanks for supporting the society again.
There's that better.
Yes, so much better.
Right. Now,
all right, James.
All right. So just point before I start here, I'm using Google Docs here, so I won't be able to see if anyone brings anything up. So just a word of caution before I start here.
So shout it, say point of order, point of information, sorry, if you want to ask James a point of information during the speech.
Okay, here we go now. So it has been said that the historian is the avenger, and that standing as judge between the parties and rivalries and causes of bygone generations, he can lift up the fallen and beat down the proud. And by his exposures and his verdicts, his satires and his moral indignation, he can punish unrighteousness and avenge the injured or reward the innocent. These are not my own words, but those of the eminent British historian Herbert Butterfield in the introduction to his 1931 work, The Whig Interpretation of History. In many ways, Butterfield's words are just as apt today as they were nearly a century ago. Butterfield's words smash the old interpretation of history with its assumptions that the present is the apex of political human development, that the political figures of yesteryear held contemporary political views, and that happily proclaimed their own biases in their historical work. In many ways, this is still the basis of the assumptions of those such as the proposition. A short while ago, I came across an online debate of sorts, held by an institution over in England. It might have been the British Museum. The event, which was in the form of a debate between academics, commentators, and others, was entitled The Trial of Henry Dundas. This concerned me in a variety of ways as a history master student, in part of as I'm aware that Dundas, the first of Viscount Melville, has become a sort of hate figure in Scotland for his stance and position on slavery, and around the time of the abolition of slave trade. What really concerned me is the rhetoric of putting the struggle figure on trial and condemning them to damnatio memoriae in the court of public opinion. I've opted to bring up this case study as it gets to the heart of this debate and what we in the opposition are appealing for, nuance and context. On face value, it appears fairly open and shut, with instance with Dundas being the second most powerful man in government in the late 18th century, supporting an amendment to legislation to abolish the slave trade from William Wilberforce in 1792, thus seeking to slow down the pace of abolition. Thus, on face value, Dundas appears a supporter of slave power, preventing the abolition of the slave trade. Thus, from this, we can see that judging people by today's standards without accounting for context and motives is clearly the right way to pursue this situation. Alas, when we apply context and nuance to the situation, it changes a fair amount. Dundas, rather than some racist troglodyte Neanderthal, had before actually spoken in favour of abolishing the slave trade and introduced a petition from his Edinburgh constituents to support the abolition of slavery. Dundas, as in effect the government's whip, understood that Parliament would never support immediate abolition, but if the word gradual was added into the legislation, pushing the date of abolition from 1792 to 1796, it had a chance to pass Parliament, and unlike Wilberforce's initial bill, it passed the Commons only to fall short in the Lords. For those history buffs among us you'll know that had this bill succeeded, slave trade would have been abolished 11 years earlier than it was in reality. If we're to take the view of the historian Mars Cowling, politicians make policy decisions based on self-preservation and material gain. The best politicians are fundamentally realists who recognise the boundaries of contemporary political values and principles. This is still the case today. Members of the House, this is but one case study, but it shows the importance of nuance in this debate. The rushing ahead to condemn historical figures based on today's moral and political values without regard for any historical context and nuance is an incredibly shoddy way to engage in historical research and inquiry. This is the historical presentism at its worst and most shabby. As a history student, it's this sort of shabby populist approach to history that worries me. A while back, I read an article by an American professor who had asked his class a hypothetical. What would their position on slavery have been had they been born white and living in the antebellum South prior to the Civil War? To little surprise, virtually every hand in the class shot up, saying that they would have been vocal and proud abolitionists who would have been tireless in their advocacy and campaigning against the institution of slavery. Of course, this is quite wishful thinking, and the professor himself responded by stating that it was potentially nonsense. Only the smallest fraction of them, if even, would have ever gone public expressing such abolition sympathies. The majority of them, as I assume here to us today, would have either quietly been uncomfortable with the practice or gone on happily supporting slave power as it benefited them and their families. Opposing what is clearly wrong, while such a position is seen as extreme and unpopular when it's not easy. Were someone from today placed in the aforementioned hypothetical and did become a strong public advocate for abolition, this is what likely would have happened to them. They would have ended up unpopular with their peers. They would have been ridiculed and attacked by the most powerful figures and institutions in society. They would have been abandoned by friends and family, mocked and belittled publicly, and would have been denied the ability to progress further in their career due to their supposedly extreme positions. Mr. President, I'd hedge a bet that as someone from today were born in those conditions, brought up as many such individuals were, educated in the same manner and conditioned in the same way, then they would likely and sadly have come to the same conclusions on this issue and on other stances and other issues as many individuals at that time sadly came to. I'd like to begin my conclusion by quoting another historian, this time the historian of Tudor and Stuart British history, G.R. Elton. Elton, in his self-described 1967 manifesto, The Practice of History, proclaimed that history for its own sake, and I quote, concerns with such problems as the reality of historical knowledge or the nature of historical thought, which only hinders the practice of history. In many ways, this is what this debate comes down to. How the historical method is to be interpreted and applied. Are we to write off history and to view it without context to the period, to the individuals, or to the nuances of the era? Or are we to view history as being founded on clear and fundamental principles, with the clear knowledge that prior generations, just like our own will be, were fallible and brought up in the conditions of their time? If members of the House do believe that nuance, the historical method, proper research, and an appreciative and nuanced understanding of the practice of history, such as the historians I've quoted thus far have proposed, should be at the cornerstone of historical study and research in our society, then I implore the House to vote against this motion and side with the opposition on this question. Thank you.
Thank you, James, for that wonderful speech. And now it turns to introduce the third speaker, the final speaker to conclude the argument for the proposition, Kira Swell.
Okay, so hello everyone. So today I am going to be arguing for the proposition this evening, and I would like to first say that we as the proposition are not saying that we should focus on this one bad thing and condemn them to hell for all eternity. That's not what we're saying here. We're saying to give them the information so that they can judge for themselves, so we can learn from it. Like, for example, I'm going to extend the example of Nazi Germany. For example, people in Nazi Germany typically supported the regime, and you know that led to the death of millions of Jewish people and people that they deemed unworthy of life, which is objectively wrong, and that's judging from a modern standard. That is objectively wrong. but I can still understand why they did it based on modern standards, because I know that propaganda is a thing. No, thank you. Because I know that propaganda is a thing. And based on modern techniques, I can go back there and go, right, I can understand why that happened. You can understand why something happened and still condemn it. And that's the nuance here. You can examine something in the past based on the context and based on what was happening on the time and still condemn that happened. And in that you get a better opinion of everything in the past. Because this idea of, how do I say, going, oh, they were all racist back then, if that makes sense, and just stopping that conversation there does a disservice to examining the past. Because more often than not, people stop the conversation there. They stop the conversation there, and most lay people stop the conversation there and go, right, okay, everyone was racist back then, and they just stop the conversation there, instead of analyzing why people were racist, instead of examining why people became what they are. Because at the end of the day, these problems have shifted into our modern society. Like, yeah, go for it.
Surely this comes down to a question of the study of history and the historical method. The proposition seems to be generally arguing that judgment is an important element of historical study, when really injecting bias and judgment to history is really quite an old school approach to history. And surely the accurate approach should be actually studying the actual facts without regard to judgment and condemnation.
I would argue that we can condemn history and we can judge it to learn from it. Like, in order to progress in society, we need to go back and go, right, that was wrong, how do we improve from this? And I would argue that in having this more complete view of history, we can have a better understanding of problems that we face today. Like, for example, there's massive systemic racism in terms of housing, in terms of, what we were taught in schools, etc. Because there's this overly glorified version of history, because often the conversation stops at, oh, okay, that was excused because they're all racist at that time, instead of getting a more global picture and judging them ourselves based on our modern views to move forward in history. In that way, we can still see the context in which it happened and still condemn it to move forward. Like, for example, the issue of systematic racism in terms of housing. Most black people live in poor areas and things like that because of the separation of black and white communities that existed way, way back in society. And I would argue that if we take this approach of judging people in the past and getting all of the information and putting it forward for us to evaluate ourselves, that means we would have, I would argue, a more global sense of history, because we would be able to take all of the context and condemn them so we can move forward. No, thank you. And to better understand where these issues come from and to fight for them. So and that goes to some solutions to modern problems. Like, for example, instead of tearing down statues and everything like that, we as a proposition propose we maybe put plaques on the statues, saying instead of, this version of, They did great things, and yes, they were racist, but we're not going to talk about that because everyone was back then. And instead of that, we put on a plaque saying, slave, did these great things, but was also a slave owner. And we choose who we put up on a pedestal in our society. And I think that would be a great thing, because at the end of the day, we cannot progress as a society if we cannot look back and go, yeah, that was wrong, we shouldn't have done it, and examine the reasons why that happened. So we can say as a society, we are not doing that again, and we hence become better as a result. We need to condemn the actions in the past in order to learn from them and continue into a better future. And thank you, everyone, and that is my speech. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Kira, for that great speech. So now it turns to our final speaker of tonight's debate to conclude the argument for the opposition, one Christopher Dawson.
Okay, same applies for me about the points of order, because I will also have my document up on screen. Okay, thank you, Mr. President, and I'd like to thank the rest of the society too. In this debate, many fine points have been made, but I fundamentally feel as if the proposition have not been true to the motion. I felt like the first speaker focused on anticipating an argument that the opposition had no intention of making, and the second two speakers both defended the notion of context and nuance in how we view historical figures, which is what the opposition came here to do tonight. I don't know what we were expected to say from their perspective, but my perspective is that they argued from our side of the argument in many ways. Firstly, I believe, yes, so I believe that our argument is based on three central truths. Firstly, that this motion is the fruit of presentism, the fascination of the perspective of the present, which is the original sin of the historian, as the historian is forever trapped in an egoistic predicament. Our side of the House believes that just as Fukuyama was wrong to say that we have reached the end point of history, the proposition side are wrong if they think that we have reached the end of moral standards. Secondly, that material conditions, material interests, money, land, resources, and the realities of violence, power, and fear warp and distort the human personality, and the struggle for control, the struggle for survival in this context shapes human history. Thirdly, we believe that the proposition has not been wholly honest with what modern standards are. The definition that they've argued from is a narrow, airbrushed, and unrealistic view of Western ethical standards, not modern standards as a whole. The proposition view of historical figures is that we should judge them by modern standards, but this leaves us without the ability to make any sense of any long periods of history. When history over time beyond the lifespans of individual historical figures is shaped by competing social forces, progressives versus conservatives, the common people versus the elite, competing regional and economic interests, how are we to make any sense of history? Considering that the social forces that resisted the expansion of the franchise to 20% of the male population in the UK were the same elite conservative social forces that resisted the expansion of the right to vote to 60% of the male population. But if we take the proposition view on these events, we view resistance to the expansion of the franchise as unrelated and drastically different to each other depending on the circumstance. The proposition motion in rejecting context and understanding that all political change is based upon what is viewed as viable or what politicians think they can get away with. To the proposition side, it must seem both a coincidence and bewildering that when, as a senator representing the Jim Crow state of Texas in the American South, Lyndon Baines Johnson was a segregationist, but when he became president of the USA, he pushed through the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act with the same zeal that he had resisted reform as a senator. The reality is that all historical figures were limited and enabled by the social forces they represented to varying degrees. We should remember that this debate is not about whether we should honour historical figures with statues or buildings, but how we should judge historical figures and thereby what the historical record should be. I don't believe that we should name buildings after Cecil Rhodes or keep around statues of Robert E. Lee, which always represented imperial power and white supremacy, which have always been wrong. We in the opposition... Oh, sorry, go ahead.
So you're saying you don't want that to happen because you're basing that on your current moral standards. So you're saying this, I don't want this to happen because you're basing it on current moral standards. So, yeah, you're kind of going against yourself.
Thank you. Well, I've already hinted at this, but I intend to criticize this idea of modern standards, and I will get to that. I'm criticizing it from perspective of things that have always been wrong, i.e. universal standards. Okay. We in the opposition also believe that we need to decolonize the study of history as well and open it up to more perspectives. It is the opinion of our side of the House that the proposition has not been honest with the definition of modern values. This side of the House does believe in certain universal values. I think I'm about to answer your question, so I'm sorry. Such as equality, human rights, democracy, freedom, and respect. But the proposition are kidding themselves if they think that these align with our modern values. We moderns practice human rights and democracy most of the time in about half of the world, and we practice forms of oligarchy or dictatorship in the rest of it. And we hardly care about equality at all. We who are fortunate enough to live in one of the wealthiest countries in the world seem to be sympathetic to those who are poor because they were born poor. But in this country, the best we can do is 0.7% of our GDP on foreign aid, and that is considered generous by the standards of Western countries. Meanwhile, we expect the poor countries of Asia, Africa, and Latin America to assume huge debts for the sin of being unable to compete in a world where the wealthy set the rules. Just as our precursors did, we still live under a system of somewhat soft white supremacy. Majority white countries control more than half of the world economy and 4 of the 5 permanent seats on the UN Council and possess the most powerful militaries too. If we were to say that the standards of the modern day are the standards of the elite, then if we judge history by modern standards, then historical figures will come out looking rather well. Thank you.
Thank you, Christopher, for that amazing speech. Is this your first maiden speech to the Society?
It's my second speech. I made a speech a couple of years ago.
Okay, thank you for that speech. Thank you once again. Okay, so now you've heard the arguments from the proposition and the opposition. Now it turns to your opportunity to ask a question to the speakers on either side. So we'll start with any questions that anyone might have directed towards the proposition. Yes, Jamie Warren.
I would just like to ask the proposition, why do they think that they shouldn't try to understand the nuances as to why certain people believe in things at the time? Surely that's a more sort of mature way of viewing history than what they're saying of simply cancelling certain aspects of history that don't match up to modern day standards.
Okay, so the question to the proposition. So the proposition can decide who to respond on why you reject the nuance element. Keir Crozier, I think. Are you doing it or not? Yeah. Or Kira or anyone or Laura.
I could do it, or you, Kira. I don't really mind.
Yeah, I'm happy enough to do it. I would say that I think you've kind of got the wrong end of the stick in terms of you've accused us of wanting to cancel people. We don't want to cancel anyone. What we want to do is to reevaluate people through the prism of our own values to get a better idea of their true worth to our history and our understanding, as opposed to simply writing off their negative aspects and simply putting them down as being a product of their time.
Opposition have a right to respond. If any speakers for the opposition would like to respond to that point.
I'll go first.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. I guess this really just comes to the heart of the contradictions in the proposition's argument. They're supposed to be defending one position, but they've tried to wiggle themselves over to being effectively on the same side as the opposition of this, with their arguments. I think really it is, I think to talk of the worth of historical figures based on whether they met our modern day standards is just completely the wrong end of the stick. The way to dealing with this, I recall in one of my readings from last year is, I think it was Macaulay's History of England. And for people he didn't like in history, he would simply disregard them and say, well, no, they were stupid, uneducated alcoholics. Which is completely the wrong way to be going about looking at history. This is why I think it's burned. We need to have nuance, context, and a lack of any major bias with regards to history. I think that is essentially the central argument of the opposition here today, that nuance and context are the most important points when it comes to historical inquiry.
Thank you for that, James. So now, any questions directed to the opposition? Questions directed to the opposition. Any questions for the opposition? No? Going once? Okay. Any abstaining questions? These are questions directed to both the proposition and the opposition, but neither in particular. No abstaining question. Anyone at all has a abstaining question?
It seems both of us have been very thorough with our arguments here tonight.
Yeah, so obviously the speakers on either side have answered any questions you may have had throughout this debate. Any final questions for the proposition? Questions directed to the proposition once again? Yes, Umar Ziam.
It's been very interesting to hear both from the proposition and the it's been very interesting to hear from both the proposition and the opposition that cancel culture and effectively the erasing of historical figures from the public forum is unacceptable. So do both sides then agree that cancel culture, renaming university buildings, tearing down statues against democratic authority and against public order is wrong?
Okay, so I take that as a abstaining question then, Mr. Ziam. So I'm going to say that the opposition have a right to respond to that first.
Can I go?
Yeah.
Right, thank you. Well, my personal opinion is that cancel culture does. There are definitely some pretty good examples of when cancel culture has gone too far, and when innocent people have clearly been affected by that. A lot of cancel culture, though, I think, is simply people dealing with consequences. So I would agree with you in a caveat that I would say that a lot of it goes too far, but I would even say majority of what you'd call cancel culture is, for example, you consider the Me Too movement cancel culture to a degree. So I would say that is good. That is good discourse, and I don't think it infringes on free speech at all. I think it is a rather democratic way of trying to hold people to account a lot of the time.
Thank you. Proposition to respond.
So, should I respond? Is that okay with everyone?
It's up to.
Yep, go ahead.
I'm going to presume yes. So essentially, with me, what I'd argue in terms of the propositions argument, pretty much we don't believe in the erasure of history. We don't believe in like tearing down statues and all that kind of stuff. What we're more saying is there's a great problem in our current society of, holding these figures up to like they're great people, they did this, without acknowledging the really bad things they did in their past. So what we as a proposition are saying that we should provide that information so people can choose whether to condemn them or to, say, yes, they did bad things, but I think, this outweighs it. Like, for example, Gandhi's a great example. I had no idea about all the things that were said about Gandhi tonight, and I think that's the problem, is that we're presented this, like most lay people are presented with this version of history that's very short-sighted, and we don't take in context, we don't examine great historical figures in much detail. We only look at the good things they have done instead of the bad things. So that's why I believe that we should look at their lives in context and be able to hence have a more nuanced opinion and choose to either condemn them or to still hold them to the same regard as of today. We can't hear you.
Matt, you've muted.
Thank you. Any further? Sorry, I had to mute it because the fire alarm started going off halfway through that answer there. Any further questions for either
Matthew?
Opposition?
Matthew, can I respond to that?
Didn't the proposition and opposition both had a chance to respond?
Yeah.
Yeah, it was opposition and prop, so you don't. Sorry.
No worries.
I think there's two further questions, Louis, so you will have a chance to respond to these potentially. So, Adam McKenna.
Hello, this was one for the proposition, I think. I was just wondering, I listened to both arguments. I'm sort of on the fence of course, we need to learn as much as we can about historical figures, but it seems that there's this sort of like substrata of historical figures that we're focusing on. Like, certainly in America, the statues that are getting pulled down are all politicians, and same here, it's politicians, and that's sort of the main figureheads that are the focus for this. But my question is, like, to what extent do we mean by historical figures? Like, are we just exclusive to politicians and leaders? I think religious folks have been mentioned, like Gandhi. Other people that could join him in this sort of the bad guys that are perceived as good guys would be like Mother Teresa, Mandela, but other figures like scientists and entrepreneurs and business people, other people in entertainment or whatever. So that's my question. By historical figures, are we just focusing on politicians and figureheads and stuff like that? Okay.
Proposition to respond first.
I can take that. Just on our side, historical figures means a figure, like an influential figure that has made history, that is part of history, and that's why they're an historical figure, because they're part of making history. So, of course, not just politicians, but people who are part of discovering things, and religion and business, as you said, but people who are part of creating history. I hope that answers your question.
Opposition to respond. Louis, this is your time to shine if you want to answer the question.
I can go if you
Well,
don't
that didn't
want to.
directly. Oh, well, I mean, Yeah, you go ahead if you've got the direct response to this.
Yeah. There's another question coming, I think. So maybe you can take that one. I was going to say, yeah, I largely agree with what was just said. It's my position would also be that it's historical figures largely refers to the practice of history, and of course it is the political decisions that have the greatest consequences that are the most controversial today. I suppose there hasn't been that much talk of cancelling. I suppose writers. I suppose like you could cancel Dickens or Rudyard Kipling. They've both said some pretty horrible things, but I think less of a focus has been on those figures. So yeah, I would focus on the greater actions, in my opinion.
Thank you. And we have another question now from Jasmine Thompson.
Hi. Yeah, my question was kind of directed to both. There have been kind of claims to or moves to like decolonize the curriculum. So my question was mainly, how would you propose altering the curriculum in schools to reflect, if you would, and also in universities, would you propose including kind of works from Black and minority writers and kind of debate them in schools?
Great proposition to respond first.
Can I take this? Is everyone okay? I presume so. So, okay. So essentially, yeah, I think that's fantastic. Basically, I would love to have more Black writers in curriculums. I would love to have more perspectives in our curriculum. I think our current curriculum is extremely biased in one direction. So, like, for example, if we learn about colonial history, for example, we don't really learn of many atrocities the British side has done. And, that expands over to America, where essentially there's these big historical figures that are held in high regard in American curriculums, such as Christopher Columbus, because he is heralded as discovering America, even though that was not the case, and he massacred and did awful things to the indigenous people that lived there. So that's kind of what I'd propose. Instead of this glamorized version of history, we would, learn more about what these historical figures did, so we can look at the good and the bad and basically go, yeah, they're a terrible person, or yeah, they're a terrible person, but I understand this, and kind of leave it up to the person in the school to decide. So we have these more correct versions of what they actually were, instead of this glorified version that we have in our brains.
Opposition to respond.
Should I to that?
Yeah, sure, go ahead.
Yeah, if you want to.
I mean, I'm speaking from sort of a perspective here. Is history shouldn't. I think the trends towards this have already been happening since I'd say at least about the 1990s. Essentially, the study of history now is far more open-ended and far more individuals are writing in it, and there's different perspectives. For instance, one of my classes, there's perspectives from everything from political to Marxist to women's to class to racial history. I think that obviously for people who are interested in history and from different angles, I think that is a good thing. I think one point I would say, though, is something that's generally happening more in the United States. It is sort of the attempt to use sort of a new narrative of history in sort of quite a ham-fisted manner. I think the two examples of these would be the 1619 project and then Trump's attempted a 1776 project. Trump's is a bit like the history school I've already referenced, the White History, which is basically everything's great, everything's moving towards a greater plane of political tolerance and a great political system, and it basically disregards any sort of fact that runs contrary to it as Marxist postmodernism, which is nonsense. But the alternative, of course, is the other interpretation, which 1619, which as someone who studies British history during that period, it has faults. So I think really what comes to the point is, I think with regards to history that approaches should be made with regards to actually focusing on the craft of history and the importance of fact as opposed to coming up with some new interpretation or loudly proclaiming your bias as if that's a good thing. So I think overall, really, it is great seeing more people writing in history from different backgrounds and different ethnicities and from different perspectives. But I think we should not lose sight of the fact that history should be based on facts. Not that these new approaches aren't, but that should be the central focus.
We can't hear you again.
Further questions? Thank you for both the proposition and opposition response to that. Any further questions either for the proposition, opposition, or abstaining? Just specify your question. Yes, Grant Warren.
Yeah, it's just a question to both the proposition and the opposition. I've heard conflicting kind of arguments from both the proposition, the argument, and the opposition tonight. In some cases, I've heard the proposition say during their speeches that they didn't want to just kind of blacklist certain historical figures, but then say that they wanted to basically make a prevailing opinion on a certain historical figure as either good or bad, which makes a contradiction. And I've heard the opposition say that they wouldn't judge historical figures by modern standards, yet they would. Yet I've heard someone praise cancel culture in some circumstances, yet cancel culture is a very modern standard. So I just find again that to be a contradiction. I'm just wondering what is the actual kind of line that each argument is actually going to take, because I see a bit of a mixing of both sides of the argument in both teams' statements.
Opposition to respond first.
I think this was targeted at me, so maybe I should, unless you really want to.
No, you're right. You're right.
Well, I do believe in standards, and in my argument, I said that I believe in universal standards, and I believe that modern society we should try and hold ourselves to standards. In my argument, obviously, I talked about how I think modern standards are not anything like universal standards, and in my argument, I also argued for a historical materialist view of why people are the way they are. That's not at all inconsistent with wanting to see progress in my own time. I don't think, anyway.
Thank you. Proposition to respond.
Yeah, I think. Oh, sorry, I thought I was good. Yeah, sure. I think perhaps you got slightly the wrong end of the stick here in that we aren't trying to create a new consensus around these people. We rather want to just get the facts out in the open and allow people to have their own discussions and to draw their own conclusions, as opposed to accepting an existing consensus, which is possibly not based on a full picture of facts.
Thank you. Any further questions? Proposition, opposition, or abstaining questions? Going once, going twice, going three. Oh, yeah. Okay. Well, that concludes the question element of tonight's debate. So now it turns to the vote on speaker ability. So this is where you decide who you think, based on their speeches, has won the debate. This is not your opinion. This is the speeches that you've heard based on the rhetoric and construct and facts that they brought into the debate that you have felt was stronger than the opposing side. So we are going to do this by a raise of hands because we missed quite a few votes in the vote of prior opinion. So of all those who believe that the proposition won the debate based on their speeches alone, could you raise your hands on the raise your hand button and say aye? So raise your hand if you believe the proposition won the debate based on their speeches alone. So that's 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay, Matthew, you happy with that?
Yep.
Okay. All those who believe that the opposition, based on just their speeches tonight, have won the debate, please raise your hands for nay.
And lower your hands if you voted the last one.
Yes, please do. Okay, are you happy with that, Matthew? There's a few more.
I think that's 9.
I've got 10 written. 10
but one of those people still has their hand up from last time.
Oh, okay. And all those who wish to abstain. So could everyone lower their hands now that voted before?
Umar, please put your hand down.
All those that wish to abstain, please raise your hands now. Umar, please stop voting. Okay, well, are you happy with that, Matthew?
Looks like that's 3.
Okie dokie. Right, so, Mr. Secretary, could we have the result of speaker ability, please?
Oh, with 4 votes for the proposition, 9 votes for the opposition, and 3 abstentions, the opposition has it.
Thank you. So thank you everyone for coming this evening. Thanks for engaging with us. We won't be like this for long. We'll be back in the Great Hall with our great speakers in person as soon as possible. But the debates do not start and end on a Thursday. You can get involved in our various groups on Facebook and our new Discord server, which Jay has now launched for us. So if you want to get involved, just message the page if you need guidance to get into any of the groups, whether that's our unofficial memes group that definitely doesn't exist, the Litter Forum, which definitely does exist, the Discord server as well. That's all accessible there, and we really encourage you to get involved and carry on debating on those various platforms. Tonight is the presidential debate, so the Litter Forum should be a bit more active than usual, as will, I'm sure, the Discord servers. Will be. So enjoy that if you're staying up to watch that tonight and get some discussion going. If you're going to be watching that, definitely do that. All right. Well, thank you everyone for joining us. That's all from us. And thank you and good night.